Prelude to Insurrection, a Legends of Tivara story, written by J.C. Kong, read for you by Natalie Naudis. Part 1. Jia's eyes stung. The duel had nearly claimed her fingers, but she'd finally vanquished the last of the onions. Just in time, too, as Lord Shi's 7-year-old son, Ren, reached for the platter of candies. He tripped over a rock and stumbled toward the roasting pig in the fire pit. With a sweep of her hand, she caught him by his silk sleeve, avoiding an unsavory addition to dinner. The servants' collective gasp might have sucked all the air from the outdoor kitchen. Nursemaid Lan covered her mouth in a silent scream. When she finally found her voice, her tone straddled anger and relief.
Sneaking out again? If you don't behave, young lord, the Black Fists will kidnap you and turn you into a sneak thief.
Jia buried a snicker. Frustrated mothers leveled the same empty threat in every home throughout the realm. Never had an unruly child been spirited away in the middle of the night by the boogeyman. As the adopted daughter of the Black Lotus clan master, she'd know. After all, most Black Fists were orphans like her, and rather than becoming thieves, they served as the Emperor's spies, defending the realm from threats the citizenry would never know about. Threats like Ren's father, Lord Shi. She straightened the wailing brat's embroidered green robes. The only thing the pudgy kid could defend the realm from was the legions of sweets he vanquished. She knelt down and pressed his next conquest, a sugar pastry, into his palm. With only the rebukes of the Black Lotus Masters to draw on, she summoned her most mothering voice. No bones broken, no tendons torn. You're okay. Either her sweet words and gentle tone had soothed him, or maybe the candy could take credit. The lordling grinned with fat cheeks. Bits of tongue pressed through the gaps in the lines of enameled soldiers. His adult teeth might never replenish his ranks for his war of attrition against sweets. After all, he'd likely die in the Imperial Army's surprise assault.
He's a clever one, always sneaking out.
The nursemaid's gaze raked over Jia's dirty cotton dress, pausing at her ears. Her hair must have shifted when saving the kid, revealing the tapered tips. Sucking her lower lip, Jia finger-combed several tresses to conceal the most obvious mark of her elven heritage. Hopefully the cosmetics, which made her look more human, hadn't smudged with her onion-induced tears.
You're new, aren't you?
The nursemaid's gaze shifted to meet Jia's.
Yes, Miss Lun. I'm Jia,
she bowed. I just started yesterday.
I'm sorry, I've never seen an elf, half-elf, before.
Lun cast her eyes down, then looked up with a smile too genuine for even a Black Lotus Master to fake. She pulled out 2 hairpins and proffered them.
This will help hide your ears, if that's what you want.
Jia stared at the pins, made of lacquer with inlaid mother-of-pearl. They were probably the young woman's most prized possessions. Perhaps it was an act of atonement, or maybe she wanted to exchange pins to declare sisterhood, like girls often did. Not that Jia could part with the lockpicks and throwing spikes that held up her hair. She closed the woman's hand around them. They're beautiful, but I couldn't. Lun bowed her head.
My thanks for saving the young lord. He's fast and naughty and wants to talk to miners and explore the mines. It takes all of us to ensure he doesn't run off into the camp.
She pointed to the haphazard sprawl of tents and hastily constructed wood buildings just beyond the cooking area, spiraling out from the central keep like a web spun by a drunken spider. Jia followed the gesture. Men milled about, pickaxes and shovels in hand. The layers of soot and dirt clinging to their trousers, shirts, and skin made the workers indistinguishable from one another. How sad their circumstances must have been for them to agree to work underground from sun up to sundown. Her eyes tracked one team's line back to a mine, the one heavily guarded by soldiers armed with muskets. The same group of burly men always worked there, bringing in crates from other mines. Flashes periodically blinked like lightning from inside. The other laborers' speculations ranged from gas igniting to the snores of the mythical guardian dragon. Whatever was down there had to be the reason why Lord Shi had occupied foreign territory outside the protection of the Great Wall without permission from the Emperor. Unless the clan solved this mystery within 2 days, The Imperial army would sweep in and punish Lord Shi at the point of a spear. Even if they weren't the intended targets, the poor miners and servants might catch an errant arrow or find themselves trampled under a horse hoof. The senior-most maid, Faye, lowered a platter of roasted meats and autumn vegetables. She leaned against Jia. "You're handy with a knife. I'm happy you're here to help, as long as you remember that he's mine." With a grin, she pointed her chin at a cook. The cook's pot-belly suggested he spent a little too much time tasting his work. He turned and puckered his lips in their direction. "Hurry, Faye. The Lord is entertaining foreign guests, and my masterpiece is getting cold while you chatter." "I'll take it." Jia swept the platter from Faye's hands. With a quick bow to her gawking colleagues, she trotted down the hard-packed path. At last, here was a chance to get close to Lord Shi and maybe find out just why he risked antagonizing both his foreign hosts and the Emperor. In the 6 years since leaving a high-profile assignment, she had been relegated to mission lookout due to her superior senses. This important task was her first chance to prove elvish features didn't compromise her infiltration skills. Red banners with the Great Wall insignia of Chengfu County lined the road, casting long shadows in the setting sun. It took only a minute to reach the open doors of the 3-tiered main keep. Though structurally complete, its steeply pitched tile roofs and plaster walls had yet to be painted. Guards in lamellar armor and steel helms, armed with spears and broadswords, waved her through. Unshuttered light bauble lamps illuminated the plain wood and plaster walls. Designed to deter spies, the floorboards chirped like a nightingale even under her light weight. A hallway in the Black Lotus Temple was similarly floored, so the fists could practice crossing without a sound. Still, it took practice to find the right places to step in any given castle. Right now, with so many eyes around, she'd look ridiculous tiptoeing around and letting the snacks get cold. At another set of double doors stood the middle-aged steward in light red robes, flanked by 2 guards. One stood out with his fair hair and pale skin. His blue surcoat, with its yellow eagle crest, marked him as a royal guard from the kingdom of Rotuvi, ostensible ruler of this foreign land. The steward glared at her. "What kept you so long, girl? And where is Faye?" "Girl?" Cursed the elf blood in her veins, making her appear less than half her 29 years. Jia dipped her head in contrived remorse. The food would have arrived earlier had she let the Lord's son literally burn off his baby fat. With a last scathing glance, the steward slid the doors open and hustled her in. "Jueye, the refreshments have arrived." A cool autumn breeze drifted in through the unshuttered windows to the left and blew dust from the exposed beams in the ceiling. Unlike the rest of the keep, this room boasted decorations worthy of a lord. An elaborately carved writing desk with a stack of rice paper and several brushes stood against the wall directly across from the entrance. Brush paintings and calligraphy hung in long scrolls between the windows. Magic imbued into the script and images evoked a sense of calm and deference, though clan training in resisting such magic muted the effect on Jia. The middle-aged foreigner, however, looked to be under their spell. Eyes glazed over, he slouched in a bloodwood chair, angled to the side of a small matching table. On the other side, Lord Shi sat perfectly straight, his red robes doing little to hide the rotund belly his son was working hard to match. The gentle arc of the chairs suggested friendly equality, even if magic put the two on uneven footing. Neither looked to have touched their cups of rice wine. "Come, girl, serve Ambassador Bodevoy." Lord Shi beckoned her, his sausage fingers waving as his eyes focused on the platter. Would he recognize her through the makeup after all these years? Heart squeezing, she kept her head bowed so as not to provide him with a clear view. Showing no sign of recognition, he switched to Arkothi, the language of the North, which she'd pretended not to understand when the steward hired her. "Ambassador, please enjoy some of Cathay's cuisine." Ambassador Bodevoy's eyes shifted from the platter to the Lord. "I would certainly enjoy it more if we were eating in Cathay instead of Rotuvi's territory." Jia treaded across the soft wool rug and knelt by the table. Holding the tray in one hand, she chopsticked choice slices of roasted meat onto a small plate beside the ambassador. How easy this was. Perhaps the Black Lotus clan's legendary beauty, one of the 3 young masters struck down on an ill-fated mission 30 years before, had started with a mission like this. Jia worked at the deliberate pace of a Tai Chi master. "Ambassador, your gracious king agreed to let me come." Lord Shi gestured out the window. "Look how many of your people are now working the mines instead of fomenting rebellion." The ambassador shook his head. "He did not give you permission to build a castle or to plant crops, nor to bring armed men. We must keep order, after all, and protect the mines. We also need to feed everyone." He leaned in. "As your king and I agreed, we will split the gold, 50-50. Our mining and farming expertise will turn these barren hills into your country's most profitable region." Jia set a plate before Lord Shi. So Lord Shi was looking for gold. No amount of it, nor his long friendship with the emperor, would prevent imperial wrath from befalling him. The ambassador leaned back, creating distance. "We have yet to see any gold, nor have you explained the fortress. My geomancer tells me we are very close to a major vein. Please, have patience." Lord Shi produced a nugget, half the size of a thumb, and pressed it into the ambassador's palm. Jia nearly dropped a braised carrot. Geomancers deceived the superstitious by peddling their expertise in feng shui for architecture. The only gold they ever located came from other people's purses. And indeed, the rock was pyrite, fool's gold. The ambassador's hand closed around the worthless nugget. "This fortress tells me you have found something already. The food supply suggests you plan on staying a while. You have 2 days. If we do not receive 10,000 kroons, our army waiting across the river will come and seize your mines and crops." The ambassador was apparently better at diplomacy than direction. He was pointing the wrong way. Jia sucked on her lower lip. Little did either man know that Cathay's Imperial Army of the North waited on the other side of the Great Wall. They were ready to sweep in and punish Lord Shi within 2 days as well, if Jia didn't give them a reason to call off the assault. Still, they wouldn't suffer a foreign army doing the work for them, so there was no telling who they'd attack. No matter what, the shanty town and its innocent denizens would be caught in between. Part 2. Jia had swiped the pyrite from the ambassador's pocket as he left, and now turned it over in her hand. Crouched by the door to the main keep's armory, she wondered if Lord Shi knew his find was worthless. To think he was risking a slow death for nothing. She pocketed the pyrite and pulled the lockpick from her hair. With a few quick twists, the lock yielded. Up to now, she could reasonably say she got lost. Entering the armory with no escape route could mean trouble. She took a quick look down the corridor. Nothing. Only floorboards chirping in the distance. Pushing the door open, she slipped in. Her elf vision only revealed blurry shapes in shades of green. The armory must have been well to the interior of the castle, maybe partially underground. Leaving the tray of food inside the door, she shut it and crept in. As was expected of an armory, it smelled of weapon oil and fire powder. She produced her own light bauble from a pocket sewn in her sleeve, illuminating the room. Muskets, spears, broadswords, and repeating crossbows hung from hooks on the walls. Several bundles of crossbow bolts, crates of musket balls, and kegs of fire powder stood in orderly rows. "Hello?" a high-pitched voice called from the entrance. Jia's heart leaped into her throat. How had she not heard or smelled someone approach on the Nightingale floors, or even open the door? She spun around, hand reaching for her bladed hairpin. At the entrance, the Lord's son crouched by the tray of food. A slice of roast pork disappeared into his mouth. Clan operating procedure emphasized not to leave witnesses. Kill the boy, hide the body. They'd think he ran off to the mines. Any number of weapons were well within reach. No, there had to be a better way. All kids liked games, even at the temple where they played pin the knife in the donkey and dodge blades. She hustled over to the lordling.
I was playing hide-and-go-stock with nursemaid Lan. Do you want to join? His expression brightened like a Black Fist trainee receiving his first throwing star. But first, promise you won't tell anyone you saw me. I'll bring you candy. If he nodded any faster, he'd give himself a concussion. She turned back to the room. Let's play the counting game. 20 muskets, 200 muskets, 3,000 musket balls, 500 swords, 300 spears, 200 repeaters. Yay! I win! It was all Jia could do not to gawk. Some clan members could count on sight, though only after years of training. She pointed down the hall. The floors sing. I didn't hear you come. I'll show you, he grinned. Out in the hall, the boy zigzagged on his tiptoes in repeating pattern. Jia followed his lead, never once eliciting a chirp. Maybe he'd been trained as a spy, and he'd betray her. She reached for her bladed hairpin. No child his age in the clan could replicate this feat. She withdrew the pyrite and gave it to him. Young lord, it's your turn. See if you can collect some shiny rocks like this before anyone finds you. I'll give you a head start. Easy! He dashed down the hall, sending the floorboards into a chorus of chirps. She trailed a distance behind him, pausing at corners and listening for his tittering footsteps. He wasn't heading toward the entrance, but rather in the direction of Lord Shi's quarters. Maybe the foolish lord had a whole chest of fool's gold. At the end of the corridor, the boy pushed against a blank space on the wall. Lines of light appeared first, then a secret door swung open. An escape route, in all likelihood. Jia waited a few minutes before following. Light baubles illuminated a long passage, which emerged out on a hillside. The iridescent moon, never moving from its reliable spot in the south, hung just ahead, waxing to half. The boy's red robes flashed in the twilight as he disappeared down a path. She sprinted after him. She came to a ridge which she was just starting to climb down. Maybe it would have been better to let him stumble and break his neck, leaving no witnesses to her spying. No, she reached down and grabbed his wrist. It's too late now. We can play again tomorrow. Is this where you can find the shiny rocks? Head bobbing, he pointed. At the base of the ridge was an unguarded mine. Beside it stood an enormous dome of bricks, with wisps of smoke just barely visible in the low light. From the stench of it, they were cooking rotten eggs. Just beyond that, mounds of dirt smoldered as well. What is it? The boy shrugged. They get the pretty rocks from the cave. They put them in the oven. Jia sucked on her lower lip. Perhaps Lord Shi was trying to melt out gold from pyrite, a failing proposition for sure. Come on, we'll play again tomorrow. Remember, it's our secret. She took the kid's hand. It felt plump and smooth compared to the clan children's calloused palms, but it still felt nostalgic, like the boy she'd taken under her wing 6 years ago. Part 3. Jia peered out from the wooden hovel she shared with several other female servants. The iridescent moon waxed toward its second gibbous, indicating that it was about 4 hours before midnight. Nothing stirred in the sprawl of tents, save for the occasional scurrying of a rat. She had an hour to deliver a report to the clan courier waiting at the edge of the camp. Yet, having told the steward she couldn't read, she hadn't risked bringing paper or writing instruments. She tiptoed through the bedrolls, looking at the peaceful faces of sleeping young women. They'd all been kind to her. If the Rotuvi army attacked first, there was no doubt what would happen to these poor girls. Her pack served as a pillow. From its secret compartment, she withdrew a stealth suit, tool pouch, and 3 flash powder packets. With a last look at her sleeping roommates, she slipped out into the night. Outside, the white and blue moons had yet to rise. In the darkness, Jia's elf vision perceived the world in shades of grays and greens. The guard outside the door, ostensibly there to protect the maidservants from the laborers, snored on the ground. She crept by and headed toward the kitchen. There, she shrugged out of her dress and hid it under a cauldron. She slipped into her stealth suit and pulled up the masked hood. Borrowing a knife, she slunk toward the main keep. Periodic flashes of light burst from the guarded mine.
Bauble lamps illuminated the 2 guards outside the doors. Jia slunk along the light's edge and circled around to the room where Lord Shi had met with Ambassador Bodovoy. Finding handholds in the mortar between the foundation stones, she climbed up to the now shuttered window and listened. Silence. She eased one of the leaves open and scanned the room. Nobody was there. The paper and brush from the earlier meeting remained on the desk. The room darkened when she slipped in and closed the shutter, so she withdrew her own light bauble and tiptoed to the desk. Taking the brush, she jotted a coded briefing. Lord made deal with Rotuvi King. Mining for gold. Found pyrite. King is angry. Enemy army to attack in 2 days. The floorboards chirped and voices in the hallway approached. Footsteps stopped at the doors. Light shined through the crack between them. She evaluated the room. The chairs, table, and desk would provide no cover. Holding the message between her lips and stuffing her light bauble into her pocket, Jia tiptoe sprinted toward the corner, pop-vaulted between the walls, and wedged herself between 2 of the rafters with her hands. The doors opened, revealing the steward holding a lamp and Lord Shi. The silhouettes of a short soldier and a tall, lanky man stood behind them. Jia pressed her back against the ceiling. The beams now blocked her line of sight, but at least they'd have to be right under her and happen to look up to see an eavesdropping half-elf. Her improvisation was worthy of the surgeon, the second of the deceased Black Lotus masters. She closed her eyes and listened. The Lord stomped across the room to the desk. He opened a drawer and whipped out a sheet of paper. "What do you think, General Lu? Do you have enough men to hold the hills?" General Lu? An opportunistic man. He'd tried to kill her 6 years ago, though he hadn't seen her up close and wouldn't recognize her. His footsteps came to a stop right beneath her. "Jueye, my scouts say they number 10,000 strong, armed with spears, swords, and crossbows. We have 1,000 men and 3 cannons. If we blow one of the 2 bridges, it will force them into a bottleneck. We'll rain bolts and musket balls on them. Whoever makes it across must then charge uphill and breach our palisade." Jia's arms burned from the strain of holding herself in place. Sweat gathered on her brow. It would trickle and splatter on General Lu's nose if he stood there much longer, spouting his harebrained ideas. 1,000 men might hold the high ground for now, but Rotuvi could keep sending more troops, while Lord Shi's firepower and musket ball supplies would dwindle. Then there was the Imperial Army they didn't know about, attacking from the other front. Lord Shi's question came out as a growl. "How much longer, alchemist?" The alchemist took several steps in, his long stride and light weight suggesting he was the skinny man at the back. His refined accent was that of a scholar from the capital. "The pyrite extraction process from the latest batch is done. It's been taken to the secret mine." So Lord Shi knew it wasn't really gold. Now if they'd just hurry up and reveal what they were extracting. Lord Shi's brush swished across paper. "Prepare samples to send to the Lords of the North. The Empire has exploited us for too long. Once they see we don't need them anymore, they'll join me." Jia would have gasped if it were safe to do so just then. The 2 bridges General Lu referred to were those from Cathay, not Rotuvi. Lord Shi wasn't looking to defend this land against foreigners. He was now planning on defying imperial rule. Not only that, he wanted the mineral-rich North to ally with him. The Imperial Army would be caught between this fort and the rebels occupying the Great Wall. She needed to infiltrate the secret mine and find out what samples could coax an entire region into rebellion. Now, if only Lord Shi would hurry up and leave and take the general with him before his bloodlust got doused with half-elf sweat. It was pooling on her nose now. A distraction, maybe. Something important. Modulating her voice with a mockingbird's deception to sound like Lord Shi's son, Jia threw her voice to the doors with a ghost echo. "Daddy!" She shuddered, the tone pitched too high, like a night blossom beckoning lustful men in the floating world, but at least it sounded like it came from the doors. She adjusted her voice. "Come here!" General Lu turned and took a step just as her sweat plopped soundlessly into the rug. Lord Shi, too, headed toward the door with the alchemist.
The steward folded up the message as he hastily left. The room blinked into darkness. Their chirping footsteps faded. About time. Leg and arm muscles sore, Jia dropped to the floor. Shaking out her poor limbs, she wrote a new message, blew the ink dry, and folded it in the clan's 16-crease pattern. It would tear if opened by anyone untrained in the art. Jia darted to the window, pushed open the shutter, and slipped away. She looked to the iridescent moon, now waxing halfway to its third gibbous. It was almost too late to deliver the note. She raced down the path and through the camp, pausing to evade the occasional sentry or duck behind a tent when the mine entrance flashed. When she arrived at the rendezvous point at the tree line, she let out a sparrow call. A shape emerged from behind a tree. A short sword hung at its side. "My little sister, late for once." Jia snorted. She'd taken Zheng Tian under her wing when he first arrived at the Black Lotus Temple as a shy 10-year-old. Precocious and chubby like Little Run, he'd called her big sister back then. But over 6 years, he'd physically matured into a strapping young man. Meanwhile, her elf blood had left her prepubescent and dismally flat. She flicked the message at him. "Here." "What does it say?" He swept it out of the air. He had yet to master the unfolding technique, though, knowing his mind for puzzles, he'd probably be able to piece the shreds back together if he did try to open it. "Lord Shi is planning a rebellion and wants to drag the North in with him." Tian tapped his chin. "With what? He's in foreign territory. He's risking the wrath of foreigners. And the Emperor." Her thoughts exactly. "Something's in the mine. Come with me." Tian cocked his head and held up the message. "I need to get to the way station, by the 4th gibbous. Otherwise, they'll assume you blew your cover. The Imperial Army will advance, and get caught between Lord Shi and his friends." Was it worth the risk? The secret mine likely held the answer, and with at least 4 guards, 2 black fists were better than 1. Part 4. Hiding by the tent closest to the secret mine's entrance, Jia cast a quick glance at the iridescent moon. It waxed just past its 3rd gibbous. Tian took a step behind her. He had less than an hour to make it to the way station, a half-hour away at full sprint. Maybe this was a bad idea. A trail of 3 light baubles illuminated the open space between her hiding place and the 20 paces to the cave. There were no boulders, trees, or even shrubs to provide cover, just several rocks. Unlike the sentry outside the women's lodgings, the 4 guards here stood alert. In the time it took to dash across the space, the soldiers could take aim and shoot. An arrow might be possible to catch, but a musket ball was another story. She tapped in clan code on Tian's arm. "You, 2nd light. Me, 1st and 3rd. You, right 2. Incredulousness couldn't be conveyed through code, yet somehow Tian's response managed it. "You sure?" The plan certainly wasn't worthy of the architect, the last of the 3 legendary young Black Lotus masters. Nor was Tian as good as the surgeon, and she certainly didn't qualify as the beauty. At least, not yet. Still, it might get them close without getting riddled with musket ball holes. "Now," she tapped. She picked up a rock and flung one at the first bauble. It smashed, its light blacking out. Tian dashed closer and hurled 2 stones at the second. Shattering glass and darkness indicated one had hit. Just 1 remained, shedding light out to 5 paces from the cave entrance. The soldiers shouldered their muskets. Jia surged after him and threw her voice with a ghost echo, originating to the far right. "Don't shoot! We're just looking for a private place!" "Stop!" A guard leveled his weapon on that spot. The others followed suit. Jia kicked a rock, sending it spinning and arcing into the last bauble at the cave entrance. It cracked. In the darkness, her elf vision took over. The 4 guards tightened their formation at the mine entrance, their guns sweeping back and forth. Without waiting, Tian slid to the right. Having spent a year blindfolded, he deftly avoided obstacles as he closed in rapid silence. Jia flanked to the left. "The lights!" one guard yelled. "Sound the alarm!" Another swept his gun left to right and back. Light flashed from the cave, illuminating her.
Jia's vision blurred at the sudden brightness, and the shapes of the guards turned their guns at her. 2, 3 shots rang out. Dog farts. In a few moments, the entire camp would rouse to life. She dove into a forward roll and sprung up where the rightmost guard should be. Her wrist contacted his forearm. She swept a leg behind him. With her other hand, she reached for his head and jerked him to the ground. A phoenix eye fist to the temple knocked him out. Her vision adjusted. The other guard dropped his musket. He swept his sword from its scabbard and arced it in her direction. She could have stood where she was, and the blade would have passed over her head if she were even close enough to hit. Nonetheless, she dove shoulder first into the man's shin. Hooking a hand behind his ankle, she sent him sprawling to the ground. A twist of her body dislocated his foot. She rolled over and delivered an elbow to his face. Springing to her feet, she looked around. The third guard lay moaning on the ground, while the fourth slumped in Tian's chokehold. Behind them, confused voices erupted through the shantytown. Time was running out. She bent down and liberated a guard of his dagger. "Get to the way station!" Nodding, Tian drove his heel into the semi-conscious guard, then turned and ran. Jia dashed into the mine. Her night vision failed not far from the cave entrance. The stench of rotten eggs and smoke assaulted her nose. She pulled out her light bauble, ready to hide it if she ran into someone. The smooth passage was oval-shaped, with the ceiling rising not much higher than a grown man. It was wide enough that 4 men could march abreast. It descended at an easy-to-manage slope. Lights flashed periodically. A swarm of bats zigzagged by, forcing her to duck. Muffled voices emanated from up ahead, where the tunnel opened up into a brightly lit grotto. Shadows shifted on the cave walls. At the edge of the rough-hewn cavern, she paused and looked. The walls and ceiling sparkled white, though it had been scraped away in some places. A soldier rolled a keg down a side tunnel while another pried open a crate and then followed the first. 3 rows of crates formed a semicircle around a long table where 3 more men weighed powders on scales. Beside the table sat another keg. "More charcoal!" A tall, lanky man in long robes gestured toward one of his assistants. That voice, it was the alchemist from earlier. The assistant troweled out a black powder from one of the crates into a large bowl. He passed it to the alchemist, who mixed the charcoal with yellow and white powders in a large ceramic jar. Taking a pinch, he set it on a platter. He struck a stone with a piece of metal, sending sparks into the mixture. It flashed. Jia sucked in her lower lip. It all made sense now. The bats and sparkling white walls meant saltpeter. The rotten egg smell, sulfur, apparently extracted from pyrite. And charcoal. Lord Shi was making fire powder. The alchemist with the formal accent must have been privy to the secret formula, the one which gave Cathay an advantage over its neighbors. No wonder General Liu thought they could hold out against a siege. They weren't limited to rationed supplies from the imperial court. She studied the cavern's texture. Several counties in the north mined saltpeter. They'd mined so much that they had to go deeper and into more dangerous places to find it. The clan had noted the lords of those counties complaining about quotas. With Lord Shi sitting on a new source in a defensible part of a foreign country, his insurrection might actually succeed. Voices came from the head of the mine entrance, the only way out, unless one of the side tunnels led back to the surface. And first, she needed to deal with the traitorous alchemist and his assistants, lest they spread a state secret. Taking a deep breath, she hurled her knife into the alchemist's throat. His 3 assistants watched wide-eyed as he choked up blood. He slumped to the floor. The jar of fire powder slipped from his hands and rolled half a pace across the ground. The jar. Tian might be able to calculate the yield and blast pressure, but for Jia, it was guesswork. The cost of being wrong meant having half-elf innards splattered to the cave walls. As the others crowded around the alchemist, Jia flung 2 flash packets at the fire powder trail, spun, and sprinted toward the mine entrance. A red flare lit up from behind, followed by fizzling and dancing shadows. Then, pottery shattered. Screams and coughs echoed from the cave. Jia ground to a halt. Voices and boot steps approached from the mine entrance. The tunnel was too narrow for her to get by, and if the 2 distinct coughs and 1 scream were any indication, all 3 of the assistants still lived. She turned back to the cavern.
Inside, the two choking men covered their eyes with their sleeves and waved away the thinning smoke. Pottery shards left bloody marks in their robes. The third swatted at his blazing robes, spreading the flames. Jia stayed low as she pattered over to the alchemist's body. She jerked her knife free and crept to the closest assistant, who'd suffered cuts on his upper body. He moved his arm away from his eyes just in time to see her plunge the blade between his ribs and into his lung. His face contorted, and his mouth opened in a silent scream. Bile rose in her throat. It had been years since she'd killed someone from so close. The flames would claim the second man, but there was still the third to murder, up close and in cold blood. Now footsteps thumped from a side tunnel, the soldiers who'd been moving the kegs. Her next victim rubbed his eyes. All his wounds were down around his legs where the pottery had shredded his robes. Jia leaped over the crates, slunk low, and jammed the knife into his thigh, right at the femoral artery. Blood belched out from the stab. She looked up toward the sound of footsteps. 2 soldiers emerged from the side tunnel. Jia ducked down behind the row of crates. "What happened here? An accident?" "Help!" her last victim rasped. Jia crawled low and fast around the crates in the opposite direction of the approaching voices. She rounded the row just as the men reached the table. "Heavens!" Footsteps quickened to the scene. Jia hazarded a glance over the crates. The soldiers were kneeling by the man whose thigh she'd stabbed. She slunk toward the side tunnel. "It was a girl." The dying assistant's voice came out weaker now. The men stood and looked around. One met her eyes. He drew his broadsword and pointed. "There!" More witnesses, more lives to take, if they didn't kill her first. Unlike the assistants, these were trained soldiers, nearly twice her size. Their broadswords gave them a reach advantage over her knife and dagger. She raced into the side tunnel and they lumbered after her. Light baubles on the ground illuminated the passage. Although it wasn't much wider than the access tunnel, it had rough walls and support beams. She stomped on each light as she passed, hoping the guards might trip in the darkness and fall on their swords. No such luck, and several paces ahead, the tunnel opened into another cavern. So much open space would give them an advantage. Jia stopped at the last light bauble and smashed it with her heel. She spun, dagger in one hand and knife in the other. With a light from the second cavern at her back, she'd appear as a silhouette to them. The first soldier lifted his sword, but it clanged into the ceiling. In that moment, she leaped forward with a thrust, which punched through the man's unarmored belly. He grunted as the second hip pushed him aside and started to swing his sword. It caught on the wall in a shower of sparks. Jia yanked the dagger free of the first man, the backward arc slashing through the second's palmar tendons. As his sword clattered to the ground, she jammed her knife between his ribs. 3 steps back put her into the cavern. The second man stared at his lifeless fingers while holding his other hand over his flank wound. Sword dangling in a limp grip, the first stumbled into the cavern after her. His mouth hung open, and blood flecked his lips. Surging forward, Jia set the dagger on his sword arm and stabbed to the base of his throat with the knife. His attempt to lift his weapon drew his wrist across her blade. Her knife bit deep into his neck. Behind him, the second man crumpled. She blew out a breath and surveyed the carnage. She'd just defeated 2 superior warriors by using the terrain to her advantage. Spinning around, she scanned for another exit from the cavern. The walls had been scraped clean of saltpeter. At least a dozen kegs marked fire powder stood in the middle of the room, and there were no exits. Trapped. A commotion of voices rumbled from the first grotto. No doubt they would check on the fire powder supplies and find 2 bodies and a bloodied half-elf girl in a stealth suit. She stripped down to her undergarments and wedged her suit and knife between some kegs. She yanked the pants off the dead man. Lying down, she lugged and tugged him on top of her. Then she conjured the saddest thing she could think of, being abandoned by a philandering elf father, adopted by a Black Fist clan just because she had superior senses. Tears welled in her eyes and clogged her nose. Footsteps approached. A shadow appeared above her. He turned back toward the entrance. "There's a girl here." More footsteps grew louder as he pulled the body off her. He offered a cape. "Are you all right?" Lord Shi came up behind him. Sniffling, Jia turned her head to prevent giving him a good look at her. She took the cape and covered herself.
She pointed at the body and forced a distraught tone. He tried to. She hung her head and tightened the cape around her. He was on top of me, but I grabbed his dagger and... Lord Shi studied her through narrow eyes. What were you doing down here? She sniffed. The young lord. I heard the shouts and came out. I saw the young lord run past the sleeping guards and into the mine. But then the men grabbed me. They ripped my clothes. She burst into tears. Fine, my son, Lord Shi said. Take the girl to my receiving room. Bring clothes and keep a close eye on her. Trembling all over in a performance worthy of a stage actor, Jia hung her head and followed the escort of guards. Hopefully, an escape route would present itself before they uncovered her stealth suit. Part 5. Wearing a simple dress that must have belonged to a water buffalo, Jen knelt on the carpet in Lord Shi's audience room, head bowed before his chair. The clothes hung from her small frame like laundry left out to dry. Guards stood at each window, blocking all escape routes. General Lu watched her through narrow eyes. The doors behind her opened. A set of heavy footsteps matched with lighter ones. Lord Shi came around and sat in his chair, his son at his side. My son says he was in his room sleeping. Jia raised her head and faced the boy. His eyes widened. She turned to the Lord. I swear, young Lord Shi wanted to see the mines. He thought he'd find candies. She shot the kid a meaningful look. Would he take the tacit bribe? Her fists clenched tight. The boy hung his head and burst into tears. I'm sorry, Father. Lord Shi patted his son on the head and faced her. It looks like I owe you a debt of gratitude. You will be rewarded. More than he could imagine once she escaped. Jia bowed her head. Thank you, my lord. The best reward would be to allow me to go to bed. Yes, of course. You will stay in the keep. Lord Shi peered at her, but she kept her head turned at an angle, feigning humiliation. Was his insistence that she stayed in the keep a reward or precaution? Either way, it would be harder to escape compared to the servants' hovel. She shook her head. I would rather stay with my friends. My things are there too. Nonsense. It will be more comfortable, and you will be protected, close to the officers' quarters. I'll have your things brought to you. He motioned to General Lu. General, escort the girl to her room. As you command. The general bowed and gestured her out. For now, she was stuck deeper in the dragon's jaws. She followed General Lu through the chirping halls. When they were alone, he stopped. One thing I don't understand is, we didn't find your clothes in the mine. Jia's stomach leapt into her throat. He'd always been a shrewd man and opportunist who'd turned on his first lord in order to advance. Time to use his suspicion and ambition against him. She looked left to right, then pulled him into a side room. She yanked his straight sword free and placed the tip at his throat. I'm a scout for the Imperial Army, which waits a day's march away. My partner has already revealed your troop numbers and supplies. Even if all 3,000 of your musket balls find their mark, they'll still outnumber you 10-1. Then there's the Rotuvi army to consider. If his mouth could gape any wider, a fist would fit in. Why are you telling me this? To give you a chance to resolve this problem with minimal bloodshed. The Emperor has an offer. Capture Lord Shi and turn over your fire powder, and his exaltedness will give you a command of an imperial outpost here. Or at least she'd suggest it to the clan, in hopes that they'd suggest it to the Emperor. General Lu's forehead bunched up, and his lips squeezed tight. Good. He was at least considering the offer. Or perhaps he was constipated. If he strained any harder, smoke might blow from his ears. I agree to his exaltedness's terms. Part 6. Jia zigzagged in silence over the nightingale floors to the young lord's room. Sliding the door open, she crept inside. The child jolted up from his bed. His startled eyes met hers before softening. Miss Jia, why are you here? It was amazing how alert and perceptive he was. Perhaps it helped him find Candy better.
You'll be in big trouble if you stay. I'm taking you somewhere safe.
Will there be candy? Jazz sucked on her lower lip. After a pampered childhood, he'd face hardships. But better that than being executed as a traitor's son.
No, but you'll play lots of games. Pin the knife in the donkey, dodge blades, hide and go stalk.
Prelude to Insurrection, a Legends of Tivara's story. Written by J.C. Kong.